Hello and welcome to the first choice event after the holiday break. It's amazing to see that so many of you are already back, and I hope you had a wonderful holiday time together with family and friends, and maybe some in between, even though we have this typical April weather. And I'm super happy to talk today with two experts about, I would say, more or less the holy grail of decarbonization. So the whole topic around Scope 3 emissions, how to measure them, how to understand them, how to actually get these data points. And before we directly go into it, I quickly introduce you to the webinar setup if you have not been participating yet. So first of all, you can relax because we're going to record everything and you're going to have the chance afterwards to rewatch the webinar, but also read about it. So we sent you like a read up in our climate magazine. And that doesn't mean that you cannot participate. So even though you don't have to write down notes maybe the whole time, we highly want you to be part of that webinar. So what you can do first is find the Q&A part in Zoom here. Sometimes it's shown on the button or on top. If you're having a German setup, it's Fragen und Antworten. And you can take the chance to introduce yourself to the others. And maybe you just want to share your name and from where you are listening in today, so that we find for later the Q&A setup already, and that we know where you can also the whole time ask questions. So that is your chance. Go in the chat function and maybe introduce you by name and the place from where you are listening in. And in my case, that would be, I'm Lara. I'm one of the co-founders of the Climate Choice. I think I didn't say that in the beginning. And I'm in Berlin, actually, in a very warm telephone booth. So I see here Gisela from Berlin as well, Ruth from Dublin, very nice, Elke from Vienna, and I'm not that good, I think, in pronouncing that name. Well, now you see where you can be introducing yourself and where you find the others actually who are joining today. And we invite you to always put comments, questions. You can also share your own insights that came up during maybe the next few minutes when the experts talk. So you can really take the chance to interact with each other. And the second thing is that you get an email. You already got one in the beginning and you get one afterwards. And you will be introduced to our Slack community. So you can join there and maybe also ask questions later, or just join to get like regular updates on climate news and actions. And other than that, who is the Climate Choice? Why are we doing our choice events as a webinar series? We are building the climate intelligence platform for decarbonization within companies and along the supply chain. And as we see that this is not just a topic for data and measurements or technology, it's very much a topic to collaborate, to share information, to work together with your business partners. And this is why we are setting up our choice events to bring everyone together. We are really envisioning a climate community of businesses working together on this huge challenge and finding together best practices and solutions. And this is actually why we have now our 4th climate summit coming up within just less than a month now, where we have our annual event, really bringing all our partners, customers, but then also experts from the field and beyond together. So we are very excited, for example, to have Paula, the so-called innovator inventor from the SDGs, or David from TCFD explaining us everything around climate disclosure and so on. Experts from Deutsche Bahn, Ostret, IKEA, and so on. So we are very excited to invite you there as well and really be part of that community and sharing together challenges, best practices, and taking steps along that decarbonization journey. And that has been my introduction to today's webinar. And I quickly have an, I think, interactive question for you before we introduce the experts. So you can share with us, how you are relating to that topic. Is Scope 3 measuring something that your company is already doing? Is it planned? Or no, it's also not planned? Or you maybe don't know because you're not handling that topic and you are just in general curious to learn more about it. So that is maybe a nice insight also for Jascha and Richard later to go more into it. And I see you're quite active already. Some might are thinking about it. And I can stop it and also share the result. So I'm actually surprised. 37% of you, so those are the most, already have a CO2 Scope 3 emission calculation. And then the others are planning it with 32%. And just, the lowest part is not really into that planning process or implementation. And then I want to show a second. I actually wanted to ask a second question. I think I have to use the Slack because it doesn't show up for me. Or I have to rethink if I did something wrong. So this result you already saw. Actually, Zoom had an update, so now I have to find out. Oh, I think you see it right now. And as someone already clicked on it, it worked. Perfect. So second question would be, if you're already doing your CO2 emission calculation in Scope 3, which a lot of you said yes, then do you also collect already data specifically from your suppliers to have primary data for this calculation? And you can choose from yes, no, but it's planned, no, it's not planned, and I don't know. And again, very active answers here. And I think I'm going to share the results. And you should see it. So here, the answer is a little bit different. 35% say no, but it's planned. And the yes is only 26, which is still very high, I would assume. So we have quite some experts here, which means you are very invited from my side to also share your comments, your experiences, questions during the whole time in the webinar. And I will invite now Richard and Jascha on stage. So, hello. Hi, Richard. And
hi,
Jascha.
Lara.
How are you guys?
I'm fine, thanks a lot.
Same here. Everything good. Excited to be here.
Great. Are you surprised by the answers of the poll?
Yes, a bit, definitely. So lots of experts here. I hope those experts get not bored and very much looking forward to your questions.
Yeah.
I think with Scope 3, you are never bored. It's a never-ending story. I think it's like Excel. You can always learn something new. Yes, Jascha?
Yes, also a bit surprised. Actually, great to see that so many people already do Scope 3 calculation and also even get supplier-specific data. That's great.
Amazing. Then I'm gonna listen in. I think, Richard, you're gonna start. Maybe I just join until you have shared the slides and everything is set up. And then otherwise I come later for the Q&A. So all the questions that are in the Q&A session then already posted in, I will collect and we address them after your introduction. Great, looks good for me. So then see you in a bit.
Thanks a lot, Lara. I'm Richard. I'm from Leipzig, by the way. I didn't write it down, and I welcome you here. And thanks a lot very much for the introduction, Lara. So I will give a quick introduction, and then we look in the methodology on how to calculate the Scope 3 emissions and a little bit into data sources. And then I want to show you a sample calculation and look a little bit into how the results might look like for your company. So starting with the introduction with WifOR, so where I'm working, this is an independent economic research institute, which is 14 years ago, we had a spin-off from the Technical University of Darmstadt. And meanwhile, we have 70 employees across 4 countries in the world. We have 3 research areas, one of which is impact analysis that I'm heading. What do? We are aiming for a global standard on how to measure not only the environmental, but also the economic and social impact of companies and or industries. And for that, we are working closely together with our partners, such as the Value Balancing Alliance, but also statistical authorities. And of course, we furthermore help companies and associations or ministries to assess those impacts. And one dimension is, of course, the Scope 3 GHG emissions. And I'm assuming lots of you know that Scope 3 reporting becomes mandatory under CSRD. So from 2025 onwards, nearly 50,000 EU companies need to report their Scope 3 emissions. But not only CSRD, but also the International Sustainability Standards Board, so the ISSB, which will deliver a global baseline for non-financial reporting to meet especially capital market needs, decided to include Scope 3 disclosures in their requirements. However, what is Scope 3 emissions? Scope 3 emissions are defined in the GHG protocol. And while Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions that are emitted by the company itself, and Scope 2 emissions are the emissions that are emitted due to purchased electricity, Scope 3 emissions indeed include all indirect upstream, but also downstream supply chain activities. And all upstream supply chain activities are categorized into 8 categories, which are listed here on the left, starting with purchased goods and services, which is in often cases the largest category, also because all emissions need to be included that are not listed in any of those other 8 categories. And the other 8 categories are capital goods, fuel and energy related activities, transportation and distribution, waste generated, business travel, employee commuting, and upstream leased assets. And having a look into how much are those Scope 3 emissions in comparison to Scope 1 and Scope 2, it shows that usually, especially for end products, Scope 3 upstream emissions make out the majority of the total Scope 3 of the total GHG emissions. And that's why it's so important to include them also in the reporting. However, how do we calculate those emissions? And there we have a look into the GHG protocol, and the GHG protocol suggests to different calculation methods depending on the availability of data. So the best one is, of course, the more specific data you have, the more specific data you should use. However, if you have not done a calculation, we would always start with a spend-based method that uses averages data points, and I will show you on how to use such methods, and then I hand over to Yasha later on, who will show you then on how to get a little more into, or hopefully much more into, supplier-specific data. So having a look at the spend-based method, what is a spend-based method and what do you need for that? The starting point of a spend-based method is, of course, your spend file or your purchase list, or here I wrote order placements. This is all used synonymously, and it shall include all goods and services purchased by your company, which are aligned with your financial statement. So, and we need 3 information. So the first and most important one is which products or services are bought. So do you buy chemicals, transportation services, but also scientific research services? And you also need to know where are those products and services produced. You might not always know where those products are produced, so we always then recommend to use the vendor country as a first guess. And of course, you need to know how much of those products is bought, and that in economic value. So you simply need to know how much you spend for those products. Looking at one product that you're buying here, for example, chemical products. So assuming you're you're buying chemical products worth of 300,000 euros, and you know that those chemical products are produced in the chemical industry, and you know that you buy them from the US. So now we look into model data, and in the model data, we know how much revenue the chemical industry in the US has, and we also know how much CO2 emissions the chemical industry in the US is emitting. And so we can attribute a certain amount of CO2 emissions to the revenues of your chemical products that you bought, as such that you get a portion of CO2 emissions of the chemical industry according to the revenues. However, that is not the whole CO2 emissions, because it only represents the scope 1 emissions of your supplier, which is in the chemical industry. And that is why in our model, we have a purchase list similar to your purchase list that you hopefully have from the chemical industry in the US. So that is model data. And now we look at each and every purchase item that the chemical industry in the US is buying, and we attribute a certain amount of CO2 emissions from those other industries across the whole world, because we also have the CO2 emissions and the revenues of all other industries and country combinations in the world. So that, for example, also includes the scope 2 emissions of the chemical industry in the US, because they purchase electricity, for example. Once we have done this, we look at the suppliers of the chemical industry and look at their purchase list, because the supply chain doesn't stop at the supplier of the supplier. And we go through the whole purchase list of the suppliers and do this attribution again and again. And of course, we do not do this by hand, but we might use matrix algebra for those exercises. And for applying this matrix algebra, we need to sort all those purchase lists in the right order and put it into a matrix. And the whole analysis is then called input-output analysis. And the beauty of this thing is that you can use it, that you do not need to trace all those different supply chains by hand, but you can use matrix algebra. But you can also always show where and in which supply chain tiers those emissions occur. So there's different data sources of those kind of models. One is Exciobase, you might know. There is Wired, there is Aura. But we decided, because we want to have most recent data, that we create our own table, which has 188 countries and 55 sectors, 56 sectors, that is in all about 10,000 or more than 10,000 country industry combinations. And the beauty of the thing is that you can also add additional indicators such as water consumption, energy use, land use, but also social dimension like risk of child labor. And you can do the same analysis for all those other indicators with one shot. So what do you need to do to apply this kind of analysis? You mainly need your purchase list. And this is an exemplary purchase list where we have the year in, you need to know the vendor country name, and you translate it into an ISO code. And you, in most cases, have some kind of product code in your purchase list, so you know which kind of product you're buying. And you need to translate this into the industry of the model that you're using. And that's in most cases the most of the work that you need to do, that you translate, that you look which products and services are you buying and to what industries does those products and services correspond. Then of course you need the value, here in this case in US dollar, and not unimportant, you need to categorize your spend according to the categories in the GT protocol, because you need to make sure that you do not do any double counting. So here, for example, you buy electricity from vendor A, which is then represents your scope 2 emissions, and you probably have other data points for scope 2 emissions, so that you then at the end can exclude those things. Once you have such a table, you might use a tool. So usually then you send this list to consultancies, or consultancies are doing this. But since we know that lots and lots of companies need to calculate those things, we are trying to build tools. And we have one tool in a beta stadium that I wanted to show you today, such that you can see how such a calculation might work. So I share my screen, and I hope that you can see the screen now. Yasha, can you give me a nod? if you can see the screen. Yeah, cool. Okay, so once you have this Excel file ready, you need to translate it still into CSV file, but then you can upload it here in the tool. On the left-hand side, you see already projects that are already created with other example spends. And here on the right-hand side, you can create a new project with a new spend file. And you can choose which database you want to use. And then you also need to upload different spend files because you need to know the corresponding industries. So let's use the WifOR table and choose the spend file that I prepared already and showed you on the slide. And we create the project, and you see now here that we have the required columns that I showed. So we have the year, we have the vendor country, we have the wide sector, and we have value in US dollar. But we also have additional optional columns like the scope 3 categories and also the vendor name, which I included in those columns. And now I want to calculate the GHG effects according to the scope 3 categories, and I want to know which vendors are responsible for those effects. I need to click on indirect, which is the indirect effects. You're also able to calculate induced effects, which includes then the GHG emissions caused by paying wages, which is not included in the GHG protocol, but might be interesting for an economic impact analysis. And you can click on tiers, and I'm interested in how many GHG emissions are emitted by the direct supplier and how much GHG emissions are emitted in total, the whole supply chain. And then we choose the indicator. Of course, we choose GHG emissions because that's the main thing of interest. But you can see that we have a lot of other indicators directly available. Once in physical terms, so GHG in kilograms, but also in monetized value. So we put a price tag on GHG emissions, but also on all other environmental indicators and also on social indicators, such that this analysis can also be used for due diligence laws. And we can click on calculating those effects by country if you're interested in, and I'm interested in. And now you can already see that we're now creating already more than 100,000 data points. And let's click on start calculation. And since you can imagine that if you have a quite long spend file with lots of vendors or more than 1,000 vendors, you might come up with lots of data points. And that's why we have this data configuration page, where you can choose in which impact you're interested in, which field, and on whether you're interested in where those impacts occurs, such that you do not, otherwise the data volume would be simply too much. So now the tool calculated the effects using this matrix algebra, and we see the result, and we see that 15,000 kilograms of GHG emissions are emitted due to the spend that we put in and according to our model. And on this page, we also see those other indicators that we clicked on in euros or in US dollars in monetized terms, such that we can already compare the GHG impact to other impacts. And we have the economic impact in terms of GDP contribution that is created due to the spend as a baseline. So you might be interested in where those impacts occur. And looking at, for example, the GDP contribution, we see that the most of the GDP contribution is created in Germany. However, if we look on GHG emission, which is our main interest today, we see that most of the impacts occur in China, according to our spend. However, you also want to know in which categories those impacts occur and which vendors are responsible for that, and probably also in which tiers and then in which countries those impacts occur. So you can create such beautiful sunburst diagrams. But wait, this is air pollution. You need to click on GHG emissions. And then you see that most of the GHG emissions are, like, in our example, and purchase goods and services. So this is quite plausible. And you can click in here and see that vendor K has the most GHG emissions, followed by vendor X. But vendor K only has a very small portion directly. And you see that this is in Hungary, while the rest of the supply chain mainly emits those things in China. So to get a nice overview over the vendors, you might also use a bar chart So I click here the vendor name and the tiers, and now I see from for GHG emissions my top vendors and how much GHG emissions they emit according to our model. So this is not the vendor K, but it is the spend for vendor K in a certain industry and a certain country summed up. However, you probably want to get a little deeper and a little more specific in vendor K, and that's why I now hand over to Yasha, who can explain you how to get supplier-specific data.
Thank you, Richard, and really, really great to see the tool in action. So yes, as Richard already mentioned, so the first step is typically calculating your scope 3 emissions. And the second step, of course, then if you know what your scope 3 emissions are and you know that they're occurring at specific, in scope 3.1 in specific areas, in specific hotspots, there's typically the question on, okay, so how do we come from average data points to supplier specific data points that we can actually make decisions to decarbonize. So I'll talk a little bit about on how we work with companies on acquiring and also continuously updating supplier-specific data for decarbonization. And just a few words. I'm Yasha. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at the Climate Choice. Sorry, this title is still in German, but yeah, really happy to talk you through on how we can.
Yasha, you're not showing your slides. It's still the one from Richard. Maybe Richard.
You maybe need to stop sharing yours. Maybe I'm sharing mine. I think in the bottom there's a virtual screen.
Yeah, that's normally the thing. If two people are sharing, it's always the one from the beginning. So that could be the thing. I'm
sorry, I do not find the button.
If you click on this,
I have it. Sorry.
Sometimes it's just playing around. All good. I think in the last few years with online, we all learned different tools. So now, Yasha, you can go into sharing again.
Yes, give me a second. Sorry about.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's what Yasha already shared, right? Is this transition from, if you work with spend-based data, you always work with average data. And now how are we supporting in getting primary data and engaging really the suppliers on getting your direct emissions? So here we go. I see the screen. It's up to you, Yasha.
Thank you, Lara. Perfect. So as mentioned, we're talking about acquiring and updating supplier-specific data. And as Richard mentioned, so just getting back to the point that actually emissions are purchased, right? And if you collect, like, let's imagine you're calculating with an average price, and all your suppliers give you the same average price. It's very hard to make buying decisions, right? And transferring that into a CO2 or into climate-specific decisions, because our buying decisions drive our emissions. This is how we think about that topic. So how do we get from really average information to very supplier-specific ones, so we can actually make decisions in order to decarbonize and really have an impact on our scope 3 emissions. As Richard already mentioned, this is specifically relevant for end products because, first of all, companies will need to report on their scope 3 emissions. And second of all, most of their scope 3 emissions are based on the upstream value chain. So typically when we now start asking those suppliers for data, and it's great that already have seen that a lot of you do this already, so I'm also curious on your experiences. But typically what we see when companies start to ask suppliers for specific data, they typically see these issues, right? First of all, it's like if there's data available, it's always questionable how comparable is that data. A lot of the times questionnaires are being unanswered. The data collection is an issue, right? There's things like, you know, in the US, we might use points in numbers. In Germany or in Europe, we're using commas, right? So things like that around data quality is a lot or a big issue around analyzing data then in the end and using data. But then there's also the issue of decarbonization expertise in the suppliers' companies. They might hear the first time from you as a customer about that topic, and they might not be prepared to provide you that data. Also, there might also be no decarbonization roadmap and also no plans on how to actually drive down emissions. But what the issue around this is, right? We're not only reporting on how on what the current state is, right, on our Scope 3 emissions, but we also need to report on risks that we see, and also report on how we're planning on transitioning to a low carbon economy. So and this is basically the issue, that your climate targets are at risk if your suppliers are not aligned with your climate strategy, right? Here is this Spiegel article that was recently published, and this shows basically the state of the current of the world currently, that around 50% of European companies have set climate targets, but less than 5% can currently demonstrate on really how they implement them. There's not yet serious action in supply chains. I know that we have here a lot of experts and here in this group, so it's really great that you already take the actions. But not only regulators ask for this, but also banks now pay attention to how their portfolio manages CO2 emissions. So let's get back to the concrete emission examples. There's Science-Based Targets just published a new report on what data is actually used by companies at the moment. And you can see here that in Scope 3.1, only 3% of companies currently use supplier-specific emission data. So we're here in a community, I guess, that is really far ahead and really thinking ahead, which is great. But that's not necessarily the case if you look at all the whole industries. And so as mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about how to gather supplier-specific data and at the same time start decarbonizing the supply chain. When we think about the data that we want to collect, of course, we first think about emission factors. But of course, there's this example here. So ideally, I get very specific supplier-specific data. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Richard, maybe you can say yes. Yes, okay. So ideally, we want to get all data that is specific to the supplier's product. So ideally, we want to get product carbon footprint data from specific products. But as mentioned before, often it's the case that this data is just not available because suppliers are starting to think about climate, and they might not have calculated product-specific information yet. So what we're doing at the Climate Choice is really helping companies to move from the average data approach to more supplier-specific data and understanding on where the data is available, what the quality of the data is, and how to acquire this data in a streamlined way. Because this is, of course, an activity that we need to do year by year. Yesterday, I talked to someone that is doing this for a big company, and he said to me, you know, like, we just did this once, and we need to, and we take a deep breath, and we need to do it again next year to ask suppliers for specific information. So how do we start from moving from average data to supplier-specific data, especially if we're looking at that, various levels of understanding of the climate maturity or climate management, lack of access to CO2 data, a wide distribution of suppliers. We've seen Richard shared, for example, there's suppliers in China that might have, like in that example, had more emissions, but also might be in other countries, right? And so we have to understand on how do we gather data from a wide range of suppliers. And here I want to share a case on how we are approaching this and working with companies on gathering data and understanding also the climate maturity of their supplier base. So in that case, we worked with O2 Telefonica and screened around 1,000 suppliers around their climate maturity, and also then conducted detailed analysis of the top 40 suppliers to really uncover, first of all, potentials in the supplier base to manage the decarbonization path, but also to understand, of course, where to get specific supplier data for improved reporting on Scope 3. So how do we start to understand the climate readiness or the data availability of suppliers. Of course, there's a lot of information that we might want to collect, right? We want to maybe, as mentioned, collect the PCF or LCA data. There's the corporate carbon footprint data of suppliers that we might want to understand. We want to understand also climate strategy, maybe targets, risk management. So there's a lot of things that might be interesting for you as a company. And sometimes suppliers tell me, okay, I get from 10 different customers, 10 different questionnaires that all ask different questions. So we look at this problem as we don't want only emission data, because it's not sufficient for collaboration and driving action in the supply chain. It's the basis for improving our scope 3 emissions. But what do we do if a supplier basically don't have the PCF data available? We also want to understand on what are their plans for the future to actually maybe calculate this emission data, or also have set climate targets. So in the end, we not only want to have lagging KPIs, because emissions data shows me what they have done last year, but for the purpose of collaboration and understanding, the risk forward looking, we also want to understand the climate targets and other information that gives us a sense of how ready is the supplier to go with us into the future. So how our process looks like is that we typically start with screening the suppliers first. So we ask suppliers, do you have corporate carbon footprint data? Do you have product carbon footprint data available? Do you have climate target set? And some other questions. And we basically really stay on the high level of understanding, okay, where is the company currently at in terms of climate maturity? And from that onwards, we're identifying suppliers which have the capacity or the capability to really provide PCF data. Because if you ask, let's say, 1,000 suppliers for very detailed information, and 90% might not be ready, you have an issue, right, with the data quality, and it's also an inefficient process. So think of this as a funnel, right, to kind of like really understand, okay, which suppliers are ready to provide you further data, and which you then can use, of course, and put in the nice model of that Richard showed, and then exchange the average data and the average emission factors with supplier-specific data. That can be data based on the corporate carbon footprint of the suppliers, and then via spend of your spend and the supplier's revenue, but to be calculated. But also could be that the suppliers already have PCF data, and then you can either see if they have already the PCF data for the products and services that you procure from them, or if they have the capability and they've done it for one product, you have at least the information that you can approach them and say, like, hey, we would appreciate if you do this also for our products, because we need this, and this is a strategic important topic to us. So this is the baseline, and it has the advantage to just take very little time for the suppliers. So it takes 5 minutes to answer these couple questions. And also provides you great insights to then further act. And then in the next step, as mentioned, we do a more granular analysis to actually capture the data in a standardized way, and also streamline this data collection for a lot of suppliers. So our approach is really to not only get metrics and KPIs like the corporate carbon footprint and the product carbon footprint that are relevant for scope 3 reporting, but also other topics that are relevant for forward-looking risk to work with the suppliers in your transition to low carbon economy. So we look at, okay, how is the supplier actually managing this topic of climate? What are the roles? Is there board oversight on this topic? How do they manage risk? Have they set climate targets, a topic that is coming more and more important? How do we understand the climate targets of our suppliers? SBTI, or Science-Based Targets Initiative, also requires you to set supplier engagement targets if a large amount of your emissions are coming from the supply chain. So there's more and more transparency needed around suppliers, management and emissions, because this is such a big issue that a lot of the emissions are deriving from the supply chain. So that way we can really, as mentioned, analyze the specific information of suppliers that are ready to give you this data, and then really use that, as mentioned, to improve our scope 3 reporting, but also understand where we can work with suppliers specifically to work on decarbonization measures. And as suppliers are so important to our scope 3 decarbonization calculation, first of all, but also on our net zero strategy, we're really have built we're using an approach where we say, okay, we take suppliers onto a journey. As mentioned, we show, and I can also show our tool in a second. We typically start with the screening process, and that has the advantage for the suppliers that it's fast. You get a high response rate because it just takes 5 to 10 minutes to complete this, very quick assessment. Suppliers get also feedback, right? So there's value for the suppliers to provide you the data. They get recommendations that are customized to their level of climate maturity. So suppliers that are only starting might get the recommendation that they should start to calculate their CO2 emissions on a company level. And we then take them onto, okay, setting climate targets, and they can identify KPIs and also start working on their own climate strategy. And what, of course, then helps with tools, because I already mentioned this is an exercise that needs to be done year by year. We do, of course, also streamline and automate a lot of this this process. So we're making sure suppliers are being asked for updates, and so you can also understand if there's new data available, you can also get this information. And then it's also about the quality of the data, right? So if we get then specific emission data, this emission data also then needs to be auditable in the new regulations that are coming in the EU with the CSRD. Our information that we use needs to be audited. We also, of course, if we collect emission data, we need to make sure it's documented, it's verified by an external third party, in order for you to have it or have kind of like a good understanding of the quality and the comparability also of this information. And that's where we provide suppliers a climate, we call it climate performance assessment and rating, and they can if they go through that rating, they can share this with many different customers and provide this data set once, and also have the advantage to not share this with one customer and the other customer, maybe a different set of data, but really have a data set that they can use across industries and across customers. So maybe I'm quickly sharing how this can look like. 1 second. Just let me share the right window. So in our platform, by the way, you can sign up and get a free account in our platform to trial this out. So if we screen suppliers and understand, okay, where our suppliers stand, this could be an overview of your supplier structure. So you can understand which of the suppliers have set science-based targets, which of the suppliers have maybe reported to other reporting outlets like CDP, and also understand what's the level of your suppliers. So if you now know I have 14% of my, or no, sorry, in that case, it's 39% of level 3 suppliers, I already know, okay, they have information available, and I can go further into the analysis to understand, okay, which suppliers have product-related data available, and then can approach those suppliers with a detailed analysis and provide and get this information from those suppliers directly. So just because of time reasons, I think and we have some Q&A as well, and a lot of questions that are coming up, and Lara's already here as well. I just hand it over to Lara, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, thanks a lot for both of you for the input. I think that was very a lot to digest maybe now for everyone who had their lunch break and maybe joining in while having some food. And yeah, as said, Richard was already answering some questions. So yeah, we for sure going to share the insights later with you. You get the email. And yeah, also about the tools. So for the climate choice, it's available already online. I think WifOR is opening it soon publicly. So there was already an answer for that. But maybe, yeah, there was one question I wanted to tackle first, which was like, if I'm not a scientist, can I have it in simple words? So I would maybe try to bring it first, and then you can correct me if I say it wrong or not. So what I take out of the webinar is like, for one, it's super complicated to have the exact data in scope 3. Therefore, mostly people work right now with average data and spend-based approach. And that is like just the first help to get started to like see where you are. And then how we are collaborating is to actually use the platform from the climate choice to screen which of the suppliers can provide you exact data points, because that's not really the reality for all of them yet out there. And how can you really empower them to provide you this data the second time you ask them? So also to provide them tools, how to improve, how to get the calculations done, and so on. So really take them in your own journey, and then by there gain emission data, but also improving your actually climate risk in the supply chain. So that's how I would frame it. And then maybe I go step by step and first ask Richard, there was this question coming, like, what is it with a spend-based approach? Is that something I should focus on? Does it fit to the greenhouse gas protocol or not? What is it like? Why do you start with your tool in that area? Because someone wrote, I learned spend-based is not the way I should go.
So from our experience, it shows that it is very hard a hard journey to get the full picture using primary data. Let's call it primary data in general, either LCA data or supplier specific data, especially because you need to include also not only the direct procurement spend, but also the indirect procurement spend. So there are some companies that are able to do LCAs for all their products. However, the indirect spend is always an additional problem. So the spend-based method that I have shown is a very easy to use and easy handle tool that gives you a first overview and a very detailed hotspot analysis, as I've shown to you, because you can really look at different suppliers, different countries where those impacts occur. And that's a very easy way to handle it from the first step. Then you can also already report those emissions. But of course, this is only the very beginning of the journey.
So what comes out of that is actually, like, as you said, right, you can run it for 1,000 suppliers, which will take a little bit more time in the tool, but then still you have like this assumption, which of those suppliers should I maybe address in a second screening to like get really the emission data and not stop there, but like have the first work done, as it can be really overwhelming. And I think your calculation was really great to show like, okay, you can go in different tiers already. And maybe I take that question before I go to Yasha also, to explain a little bit again, like where are these data points coming from? Because someone asked also, how is it actually possible to go into different tiers? Where do the specific data points, for example, I think transport was asked, come from? So maybe can you explain a little bit? I think you mentioned different data points and different data sets and so on. So what is used in the model? Yeah, so the model is based on industry and country combinations, so like the chemical industry in the US. And we, as I tried to explain, there's data for revenues and CO2 emissions, but all other indicators as well for the chemical industry in the US. And those data points, they come from national statistical authorities in most cases. So of course, there's some data points missing, so we do not have data for South Sudan, so we need to make assumptions there. And then there's those purchase lists of those industries that are in the model, and those purchase lists are also coming from national statistical authorities that build those things. However, they only build them nationally. And then there's academic and scientists that try to combine those different purchase lists to global purchase lists. And we are one of those academians that try to combine those models
using different assumptions then and different data sources.
Yeah, so again, it's maybe something, as a lot of the audience has already run their own emission calculation. I think all of us know these very simple calculators for CO2 emissions in like scope 1 and 2, and you often can even take averages, and it says, okay, if you don't know how much coffee you drink or whatever, or like energy you use, then you just take the average. And here you have it maybe more advanced for scope 3. You're using the averages of how a supplier that is in this country, in this industry, typically, or which kind of purchasing list that supplier has, and you use the average again and the different data sets behind it.
May I add one very important advantage, since we are looking towards supplier-specific data, and oftentimes you get supplier-specific data, but only for scope 1 and scope 2. And the model allows you to trace the scope 1 emissions of the supplier and the scope 2 emissions, as such that you can then carve out the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but still have an estimate on scope 3 emissions of the same company.
Yeah, it's always fascinating. The moment you go down this rabbit hole, it's like someone else's scope 1 and 2 is your scope 3, and it becomes this chain. So yeah, I think it's a little bit weird to think about it, but yeah. And yeah, from there I would lead to Yasha. So there was this question, so how do you actually then encourage suppliers to enter the specific emission data? So we learned already it's not the one that the tool from Richard is focusing on. You can put it later in there, but it's not, they're not working yet in the first place with these data points. So how is the Climate Choice working on getting these data points?
Sure. So basically, so what we do is so first of all, we help you to incentivize suppliers to provide you data, right, and make it mostly easy for suppliers. So we always speak about data acquisition not being a one-way street. If you just say to the suppliers, let's say, okay, please give me this, but there's no reason. I mean, like, where's the incentive, right? That is always a big question, and that's why we're specialized basically on that and providing, for example, benchmarks and insights to suppliers based on the data that they provide. So think of it as if your suppliers in a specific purchasing category provide you data, they can then benchmark also with other suppliers in your purchasing category, of all course anonymously, but they understand and are incentivized also to take action and improve. So this is how we approach it, and this is also why this is very specific, or like let's say two different problems often, right? So we have one of the time on the one hand we have the reporting that ideally uses the best data available, right? We're focusing on okay, how do we get that data from from suppliers directly, and where are maybe other sources that suppliers have maybe already reported data in, so such as CDP, where you can then acquire that data and reuse that information if possible. Maybe hopefully that answers the question, because
I would have a different question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, it goes in the you need incentives. It cannot be one-way street. Everyone had done that already, contacting their suppliers, assessing them for various topics. It should be like encouraging, and you want to have a good collaboration going onwards, right? As it will be an annually repeating process. You need to give back. So really you shared like, okay, there's data so you can share where are they standing compared to the other suppliers in the supply chain, what are the best practices they can use, and how can they improve, and provide them resources and tools to do so. Maybe one point that already also came up is like, as it's in self-answering process, so to say, what is about data quality and comparability maybe of these data points?
So what we do, we check each documentation of each data point. So basically, if suppliers report data, there's basically a digital process that we have set up, which is humanly. So there's actually one of our analysts that really checks the information. So suppliers need to upload the documentation of the calculation of their data, and also show that it's externally verified by a third party. And we make sure the data is correct, basically, and it's documented.
So first there's a digital proof, and then there's a last check, right, for human proofs. And also what is maybe to be mentioned, some people work with auditors so that these data points can be shared again, like the financial, I think we talked about it, the financial market is looking more and more into it. It's not enough to have your numbers done for yourself and store them and never to be looked again. You will have to report them, and people need to see that it's done in a proper way, right? Great. Yeah, I try to bring like a summary to like all the insights that we have, but that's for sure like how I structure it. So maybe I give it back to Richard and you, Yasha. What is it you wish people take out for their Scope 3 calculation? How can they address the topic? And what is your strategy to take the next step? So maybe Richard, you go first.
Oh, wow. That's a hard question. So maybe it's important to say that this is a how can I say, this is a co-creation journey that you need to take. So it's not about a one run exercise and then stopping, but it's even hard to get your first estimations and then to set targets based on this first estimation and then get better. It really involves lots of people, lots of engagement also within the company, but also outside the company, like your suppliers. But it's also a very fascinating journey, and it's a lot of fun. So maybe I stop with that. Let's keep having fun and looking forward to more questions. I try to answer them in chat afterwards. Thanks.
Yasha, what is it you?
Yeah, I encourage us to start. I mean, like the thing is, you know, like climate data is becoming financial data. The whole company will need to understand on how to what drives emissions. I think it's more about starting than getting a perfect reporting. I think that is the big change that is happening. And that's why I would also like to encourage, rather start working with suppliers. Also, if they cannot provide you the data yet, right, it's good to start those conversations, and always, of course, not only think about the reporting part, but also about the impact part and how you can already start actually having an impact and driving decarbonization across the supply chain, because that needs to happen in parallel. Yeah, I hope that that came across.
Good. Yeah, then I actually have a last thing to share as well. And Yasha, I would ask you to share the last slide of your presentation. I think I put it in there. So as we are running towards the summit, what I shared in the beginning, this will be totally about that topic. So this year, the topic is how to decarbonize companies and their supply chain and to make it really happen, because I think we are all talking about it and we are all struggling and having the same challenges, but we are not so much often talking to people in other industries, learning from the people who are already in the process, and like, yeah, maybe sharing best practices, but for most important, I think also the challenges. So that's really what the summit is about. It's the 4th year we are organizing it. It's an online conference. So you don't have to spend the whole day. You can pick out what you want, but we have very high experts going in deep dive workshops where you can tackle the topic of Scope 3, but also like upskill training of your employees, or like really also getting the basics around data management in that area. So we really saw there's a need to specifically talk about climate because there's so much noise around it. And this conference has played in the last 3 years was a really strong role in bringing all the different decision makers together. So you can check it out at climate.de, or you can take your mobile out, take a screenshot of this QR code and send us today an email that you are interested in joining. And from everyone from this webinar, we will send 2 times 2 free tickets to join and give back and make you part of the community of that summit. So either you find our email, it's lara@theclimatechoice.de. You can write me personally, or you can take this QR code, and then I'm very happy to send 2 times 2 free tickets to the summit, and you can go very much in detail, but with more time than today, into the topic of supply chain decarbonization and Scope 3. So yeah, I'm excited to get your email, and thanks a lot, Jascha, for sharing here. And I think we are wonderful in time. So Richard, Jascha, I very much thank you for this lunch break, and I wish you a very good afternoon ahead.
Thanks a
would
lot,
say-
Lara.
Thank you.
Jascha.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon. And yeah, thanks a lot for your attention.
Bye-bye.
Bye.